300 men. A desert with no end, and not a single drop of water. Not a canteen, not a jerry can, not a muddy puddle at the bottom of a shell crater. Nothing. The last water had been drunk, the last drop had been rationed, and the enemy was closing in from 3 directions.
Here is what nobody tells you about dying of thirst in combat. It doesn't arrive like a wave, it creeps. First, your mouth dries out, then your lips crack, then your vision starts to blur at the edges, then the sounds begin, voices that aren't there, the distant rush of a stream that exists only in your mind. And the whole time, you're still expected to hold a rifle.
It's June 1942, the Libyan desert. And the 2nd Battalion, the Rifle Brigade, 300 soldiers of the British 8th Army, have just entered a situation that, by every military calculation, they should not survive. No water, enemy forces on 3 sides, temperatures climbing past 45 degrees Celsius. What happened next over the following 72 hours would never make the front pages. It would never be turned into a film. For decades, it survived only in handwritten diaries, regimental records, and the memories of men who came home and never spoke about it. Until now. To understand how 300 men ended up trapped without water in the middle of the Sahara, you need to understand what had just happened to the British war effort in North Africa. And the answer is, it had collapsed. June 21st, 1942. Tobruk falls. The garrison at Tobruk had held for nearly a year. 33,000 Allied troops gone, surrendered in a single day. It was one of the most devastating defeats in British military history, and Winston Churchill, sitting in Washington when the news arrived, later wrote that he felt the ground shift beneath him. But here's what the history books don't emphasize enough. When Tobruk fell, it didn't just mean prisoners and lost ground. It meant that every unit operating south and west of the city was suddenly cut off. Supply lines gone. Withdrawal routes gone. Communication, in many cases, gone. Into that chaos stepped General Erwin Rommel, methodical, relentless, and moving east faster than anyone thought possible. His 21st Panzer Division and the 90th Light Africa Division weren't chasing the retreating British, they were cutting ahead of them. And one of the units they were about to cut off was the 2nd Battalion, the Rifle Brigade. These were not green soldiers. They had been in the desert since 1940. They had fought at Sidi Rezeg, at Gazala, along the Trig Capuzzo. They knew what the desert could do. They respected it the way you respect something that has already tried to kill you more than once. Their commanding officer was Lieutenant Colonel Victor Turner. Quiet, precise, the kind of man who spoke in measured sentences even when everything around him was on fire. His soldiers trusted him completely, which, in the next 72 hours, was the only reason any of them had a chance. On the morning of June 22, 1942, Turner received his orders. Withdraw east toward the Egyptian border. Hold blocking positions. Slow the German advance. The battalion moved out at 0600 hours. 312 men, 47 vehicles, and enough water for approximately 36 hours. What none of them knew, what no one could have known, was that they were never going to find a resupply. That 36 hours of water was all they had in the world, and the clock had already started. The first sign that something was wrong came at 0940 hours, not from behind them, where Rommel's main force was pushing east, from the northwest. Dust columns, rising slow and deliberate against the white morning sky. German reconnaissance units moving parallel to the battalion's route, not chasing them, flanking them. Turner made the call immediately: swing south, avoid contact, outmaneuver them. It was the right tactical decision. It was also the decision that sealed their fate. Because south meant away from the nearest water point, a cistern at a desert junction the men called Bir el Gubi. South meant deeper into the Erg, the great Libyan sand sea, where the ground turns soft and treacherous and vehicles slow to a crawl. South meant longer, further, hotter. By 1400 hours they had lost 3 vehicles to the sand, engines cooked, tires buried to the axles, no way to recover them. The water in those vehicles, 12 jerry cans, was transferred to the main column. Turner's quartermaster did the arithmetic quickly and said nothing. The men had already started rationing without being told. Veterans do that. You read the desert the same way you read a face. And right now, the desert was telling them something they didn't want to hear. Private James Holloway, a 21-year-old rifleman from Wiltshire, wrote in his diary that evening. He wrote, "Down to half a mug by tea time. Sergeant said resupply by morning. We all knew he was lying. We needed to believe it anyway." They did not receive resupply by morning. At 0200 hours on June 23rd, a radio message arrived from brigade headquarters. Short, brutal. The withdrawal route to the northeast had been cut. German armored units confirmed. The eastern route was contested. To the south, 60 miles of open desert with no known water sources and no guarantee of anything on the other side. Turner gathered his company commanders in the dark, a hooded torch over a map, 4 officers looking at lines on paper, knowing that none of the lines led anywhere good. He laid out the situation plainly, the way he always did. Then he gave the order: hold position through the day, dig in, send patrols to probe for a gap, attempt breakout after nightfall. What followed was the longest day any of them had ever lived. By 0800 hours, the temperature had reached 43 degrees Celsius. The men had now been awake for over 26 hours. Water rations had been cut again, down to roughly 100 milliliters per man per day. Let that number sit for a moment. 100 milliliters, less than half a cup, in 43-degree heat, for men expected to dig defensive positions and prepare for a firefight. The human body, at rest in that heat, needs between 4 and 6 liters just to survive. These men had 1/10 of that, and they were not at rest. At 10:30 hours, the first man went down. Corporal David Marsh, Brengunner, Leeds, 24 years old. He didn't collapse dramatically. He simply sat down beside his vehicle, slowly, like a man who had finally decided he was tired. His skin had gone gray and dry. He couldn't sweat. That was the sign that frightened Captain Reginald Farrow, the battalion's medical officer. Sweating stops when the body runs out of fluid to spare. After that, the core temperature rises until the brain begins to fail. Farrow had no intravenous fluids. He had almost no water. He poured what was left of his own daily ration over Marsh's neck and wrists and moved him into the shade under a vehicle. Marsh survived. 4 more men would follow him before the sun went down. At 11:15 hours, a German aircraft appeared. A Fiesler Fi-156 Storch, a light reconnaissance plane, slow and low. It circled to the north for 8 minutes, then turned and flew away. It had seen them. Coordinates would be radioed back within the hour. By 1400 hours, 2 German armored cars from the 3rd Reconnaissance Battalion were sitting on the ridge to the northwest, approximately 1,800 yards away. They weren't advancing, they were watching, waiting. the way predators wait when they know there is no urgency. Turner ordered his anti-tank platoon to deploy the 6-pounder guns on the northern perimeter. Then he ordered the infantry to dig firing positions. In 43-degree heat, with 100 milliliters of water in their bodies, the men dug. Sergeant Albert Cross, 12 years in the Rifle Brigade, a man who had seen more of the desert than most, described it this way. Every stroke of the entrenching tool cost you something. You could feel yourself getting lighter, not in a good way. You kept going because the bloke next to you was keeping going. At 16:30 hours, the German armored cars pulled back from the ridge. Turner watched them go and felt no relief. When reconnaissance units withdraw without engaging, it means one thing. They are making space for something heavier to move up. Night brought cold. That is the cruelty of the Sahara that no one outside it fully understands. The same desert that tried to kill you at 47 degrees during the day drops to 14 degrees Celsius after midnight. Men who had been burning for 12 hours now shivered in shallow slit trenches, their bodies having nothing left for temperature regulation. Several men reported hearing water, a stream, voices, distant rain, hallucinations, the desert's final insult, offering the one thing it refuses to give. Holloway wrote, "Heard a stream last night, clear as anything, woke me straight up. It was just the wind going over the rim of my tin hat." Dawn on June 24th came like a sentence being read aloud. At 05:30 hours, Turner's quartermaster, Lieutenant Frank Hastings, walked the perimeter with the last water container, a 5-gallon drum barely a quarter full. He moved from man to man without speaking. Each soldier held out whatever vessel he had. 80 milliliters each, less than a third of a cup. Some of them didn't swallow immediately. They held it in their mouths, just to feel it, just to have that sensation of something cold and real for a few more seconds before it was gone. A few men wept, quietly, without shame. Most did not. By 0600 hours, the battalion had 287 men fit enough to stand. 25 were too weakened to hold a weapon. 3 were unconscious. Captain Farrow moved between them with wet cloth and shade and nothing else, feeling, as he later wrote, entirely and completely useless for the first time in my career. At 0710 hours, the Germans moved. Approximately 20 vehicles emerged from the north. SDKF 251 half-tracks leading, wheeled transport behind. Dust columns to the rear indicated armored support. Intelligence later identified this as a company-strength element of Kampfgruppe Marx operating under the 90th Light Africa Division. They were not rushing. They had no reason to rush. Turner looked at the approaching column. Then he looked at his men. 287 soldiers with rifles and 6 anti-tank guns and roughly 4 hours of ammunition. Men who hadn't had a real drink of water in 36 hours. This was the moment when, by every rational calculation, it was over. He called his company commanders together for the second time in 2 days. He spoke quietly, the way he always spoke. He said they had 2 options: attempt to negotiate surrender terms now, while the battalion still had fighting strength and could bargain from a position of dignity, or attempt the southern breakout that night, 60 miles of open desert, knowing that some of the men might not make it. He laid out both options without editorializing. Then he stopped speaking. There was silence. Then Major Peter Vaux, commanding A Company, said, "The men didn't march across half of North Africa to hand themselves over to a column of half-tracks." No vote was taken. None was needed. Turner ordered the breakout for 2100 hours. For the next 12 hours, while German vehicles probed the battalion's perimeter and traded fire with the 6-pounder crews, the men prepared. Every non-essential piece of equipment was stripped from the vehicles and buried. Fuel was consolidated. The weakest men were loaded onto the trucks that had the best chance of crossing soft sand. Then they waited. No one slept. There was nothing left in their bodies to sleep with. They sat beside their vehicles in the afternoon heat, each man alone with whatever was keeping him going, and they waited for the sun to go down. At 21:45 hours on June 24, 1942, Lieutenant Colonel Victor Turner gave the order to move. The column rolled south into complete darkness, no headlights, engines at the lowest throttle that would still move weight through soft sand, navigation by compass and starlight, the same stars that have guided people across this desert for 3,000 years, indifferent to everything happening beneath them. The first hour was brutal. Soft sand, the kind that looks like solid ground and isn't. 2 trucks went down in the first 6 miles, axle deep, irrecoverable. Their crews stripped everything of value and climbed onto already overloaded vehicles. The men who had been passengers were now walking, with whatever was left in their bodies after 60 hours without proper water. They walked anyway. Then, at 23:40 hours, the lead scout vehicle stopped. The driver got out. He didn't say anything. He knelt in the sand and pressed his palm flat against the ground. He held it there. Then he looked back at the vehicle behind him and said 2 words. "It's damp." They had found a wadi, a dry seasonal riverbed, and beneath its floor, at maybe 18 inches of depth, groundwater. Minimal, brackish, the kind of water that on any other day you would hesitate to give to an animal. Captain Farrow was at the front of the column within 90 seconds. The men dug with their hands, with helmets, with entrenching tools worn down to the handle. Brown water, smelling of minerals and earth, seeped into the depressions. Farrow managed the distribution himself. The unconscious men first, then the worst cases, then the rest, moving fast, keeping order, keeping people from drinking too quickly and bringing it straight back up. Each man got approximately 200 milliliters, 1 cup. Turner stood at the edge of the wadi and watched the northern horizon. No pursuit, not yet. He gave them 11 minutes at the water. Then he ordered the column to move. They moved. By 400 hours on June 25th, the beginning of the 4th day, they had covered 30 miles. The worst of the sand sea was behind them. Ground was firming up. Vehicles were finding their pace again. At 0620 hours, the radio operator in the lead vehicle picked up a signal. British, 4th Light Armored Brigade, operating in the area. Turner responded on the net. Position given, situation given. At the other end, someone confirmed receipt and said, "Hold your heading, we're coming to you." At 8:47 hours on June 25, 1942, a convoy of 3 trucks came over a low rise in the desert and stopped 50 yards from Turner's lead vehicle. Water, rations, fuel. Turner's column halted. The men climbed out. No one ran, no one shouted. They stood beside their vehicles in the early morning light, and when the order came to move to the water point, they walked forward, in a queue, because they were soldiers, and that is what soldiers do, even when they have been through something that would have ended most human beings. Sergeant Cross said, "No one cheered. I thought that was strange. Later I understood. We were past cheering. We were just grateful to still be standing there to receive it." Here is the final count. 312 men set out on June 22nd. 287 reached Allied lines on June 25th. 3 men died. Private Kenneth Morse, taken by heat stroke on the afternoon of June 23rd, and 2 men whose vehicle disappeared during the night march south and was never found. 17 men were hospitalized for heat stroke and dehydration. The rest were back in action within days. Not a single vehicle was lost to enemy fire. The battalion's 6 6-pounder anti-tank guns came out intact.
Turner mentioned this in his after-action report. It was the detail he was most proud of. Kampfgruppe Marx swept into the battalion's last position on the morning of June 25th and found nothing. Tire tracks, buried equipment, 3 shallow holes in the floor of a wadi, still faintly damp. The Rifle Brigade had walked through the net.
Lieutenant Colonel Victor Turner went on to fight at the Second Battle of El Alamein 4 months later. On the night of October 27, 1942, during the fighting around Kidney Ridge, he performed actions that earned him the Victoria Cross, Britain's highest military honor. The same qualities were on display, the same quiet authority, the same refusal to accept that the situation was unwinnable. Captain Faro was mentioned in dispatches. For what he achieved in that desert with no equipment, no supplies, and no options, it feels like the least the record could do. Private James Holloway came home to Wiltshire in 1943. He never gave an interview. He never spoke publicly about those 3 days. His diary, the one that contains the only first-hand account of what the men experienced hour by hour, sits in the Imperial War Museum collection in London. The last entry he wrote from that period was the evening of June 25th, a few hours after the water convoy arrived. It was 4 words: "Drank 3 cups, tasted like church." This story was never in the newspapers. It had nothing the newspapers wanted, no single heroic charge, no famous name, no dramatic photograph. What it had was quieter and in many ways harder to explain. 300 men looked at an impossible situation and refused to let it make the decision for them. They were thirsty beyond what most of us will ever understand. They were surrounded. They were running out of everything: water, ammunition, time, strength, and they chose to keep moving. In the end, that was enough. It is almost always enough. Most of those men never talked about those 72 hours again. They came home, they lived their lives, and they took this story with them when they died. But now, you know. This is what the Second World War actually looked like. Not just the famous battles and the famous names, but the 300 men nobody photographed, holding the line in a desert with nothing left in their bodies, refusing to quit. There are thousands of stories like this one. We're going to find every single one of them. Subscribe to our YouTube channel, America and World War II Stories. These men deserve to be remembered.